Voilà, voilà. Mesdames, Messieurs, j'espère...
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry we've had a short delay because we had some technical issues. Hopefully all those who are connected can put on their cameras and mics. So, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, thank you to the Intergroup Bureau and Secretariat for organizing this meeting. Thank you to colleagues and participants here in Strasbourg, and also the over 300 people following us online from all countries across the European Union. Let me give the floor to the co-president, Alexander Ben-Huber, for 5 minutes.
Merci, Alexander.
Thank you, Alexander.
Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, and it's once again a big pleasure for us to co-host our intergroup meeting after the summer break. So it's very glad to see so many colleagues here, both in person and online. And the European Commission Vision for Agriculture and Food highlights that traditions, territories, and culture remain central pillars of our European way of life. This also means recognizing the diversity of our food systems and the role that different types of food, plant-based as well as animal-based, play in ensuring health diets and sustainable society. Too often the debate around food is reduced to black and white. One group of food is good and the other one is bad, but the reality is much more complex. Animal-sourced foods such as meat, fish, milk, and eggs are rich on essential nutrients and have been part of European diets and traditions for centuries. At the same time, we must acknowledge the need for continuous improvement in production methods, transparency, and sustainability. Today's discussion will help us to light on the nutrition value of animal proteins, the possible alternatives, and the health implication of different dietary choices. So I strongly believe that consumers deserve across the reliable science-based information, not ideology, so that they can make informed decisions for themselves and their families. As policymakers, our responsibility is to ensure that the European food system continues to provide safe, high quality and affordable nutrition for all, while supporting our farmers and respecting our environment. I'm very looking forward for today's exchange and to hear from our distinguished experts that join us today. So we are really looking forward to hear all these details as always, and I think it's really a good opportunity always to have so good experts here and getting information. So big thanks, and also colleagues from the Parliament who are here joining our meeting. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Benoit.
Merci.
Thank you, Alexander. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, as we usually do within this intergroup, we take the opportunity to pose a specific question and put forward a number of very well issues that we need to respond to. The question today is the following. What does a food-based regime with significantly less animal protein mean? We're going to hear from experts, but I would like to raise a few issues beforehand which I think are crucial for us. We as politicians, if we want to devise balanced public policies which are really beneficial for human health and the health of our European citizens, we find that some people are stigmatized, criminalized. Red meat continues to be demonstrated to have a negative impact. Types of cooking are criticized for being adverse to health, and cultural identities are thereby highly involved. But is this criminalization justified? This is an issue which I do think we should be looking at very cautiously and with proper scientific rigor. We live at a time when it's too easy to categorize foods, good on the one hand, bad on the other. However, needs are not the same for every individual. you have a child and an adolescent which doesn't need the same as an adult. We have an older person, a pregnant lady, and they need specific diets. So animal protein for some people remains indispensable. If we take out animal proteins from our foods, how do we replace them? As a parent of 4 children, I can assure you that it is not always very easy to encourage them to eat a plate of lentils. So, as well as that, how can we ensure that we get a well-balanced protein diet? So looking at vegetal options which are proposed to us, a lot of those are highly processed products. So, as a question, do we have enough studies which are being carried out on the impact of these highly processed products on human health? I should like to raise an important issue. I'm very pleased that the amendment of my colleague Céline Imar has been adopted. I co-signed it, referring to meat and such foods in our diet. And we feel that we have to do the same thing for meat as we have done for milk, not just for our livestock breeders, but also for our consumers. So, does a vegetal steak actually offer the same protein as a meat steak does? I should also like to hear the opinion of our guests on this. Ladies and gentlemen, issues relating to foods are at the heart of our agricultural, environmental, cultural, and health policies. And we need to be guided by science in order that we can guarantee that people have a varied, balanced, and healthy diet throughout Europe. Thank you very much indeed. I should now like to give the floor to Ms. Flaminia Ortenzi from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, who is an expert in food sciences, nutrition, and world health. She is going to be looking at how nutritionally valuable animal-sourced foods are. You have 15 minutes, Ms. Ortenzi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. I'm a bit too short to reach the mic. It's an honor to be here today with all of you to address this important question. I'm Flaminia Ortenzi. I work as a researcher at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and I'm also pursuing a PhD at the Free University of Amsterdam. And today I'll try to tackle a very, very complex question in 15 minutes, hoping that at least I leave you with some key messages for implementation in policies and programs. This is just the outline. So in order to address the question, what is the nutritional value of animal source foods and why are they important for global public health, I'm going to take a step back and start from a related question, which is whether deficiencies and inadequacies in essential nutrients are just a low and middle income country problem, or whether this is something that we in Europe and in the global north at large should we be concerned about as well. This is a figure from the latest publication on the global burden of hidden hunger, meaning deficiencies and inadequacies in essential micronutrients. That was published last year in The Lancet. It's a study in which I was involved. And as you can see, there's about half of the global population that have inadequate intakes in several essential micronutrients. Some of the numbers reported here may be striking. There's over 5 billion people that do not consume enough iodine, vitamin E, calcium. There's over 4 billion people that don't consume enough iron, riboflavin, folate, vitamin C. All of these nutrients play key roles in the human body for metabolic functions, cognitive and immune functions, for growth and development in children, for maintenance of bone health and muscle mass in the elderly, for pregnancy and lactation, and the more the better. What I actually want to focus your attention on, though, is the fact that the orange, red, and yellow colors in the maps that are shown on the right side of the slide do not only concentrate in the global south, but are actually also present in the global north. So you can see some patches of yellow, orange, and light green, meaning high prevalence of deficiencies and inadequacies, also in Europe, in the US, in Australia, in Japan, and so on. I've pulled out 2 country examples from the same study. I could have chosen any country. I decided to pick the country that I originate from, which is Italy, and Kenya, which is one of the countries where I conduct research at GAIN. You might think that the heat map for Kenya should look completely red, meaning high prevalence of deficiency across micronutrients and across demographic groups, meaning sex and age groups, and that the map for Italy should look, let's say, bluish or greenish for the most part. In reality, the 2 heat maps are not that different. And this tells us that although, yes, Kenya suffers from a higher burden than Italy in terms of micronutrient inadequacies, in reality, these are widespread also in developed countries like Italy, located in the south of Europe, and especially for vitamin E, folate, magnesium, iron, and thiamine, as you can see. What happens when we move from looking at the global population to focusing on specific vulnerable groups? Well, the situation looks even worse. So if we think about children of preschool age, meaning under 5, or women of reproductive age, so between 15 and 49 years old, the situation actually looks very worrisome. There's about 50% of the world's children and about 2/3 of the world's women that suffer from at least one deficiency in an essential micronutrient. And again, the point that I want to stress is that although most of these women and children live in the global south, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, there's actually a significant proportion that are found in our countries in the global north. And a classic example that I find particularly exemplifying of this is the UK. As you can see from the graphs on the right side of the slide, the proportion of children in panel A and women in panel B in the UK that suffer from at least one micronutrient deficiency is very high. We're talking 40% children and 55% women of reproductive age. And these deficiencies are primarily driven by iron and vitamin D deficiency in children, and by a mix of iron, folate, vitamin D, zinc, and others in women. Interestingly enough, if you look at the prevalence of deficiencies in Guatemala or Mexico, they're actually not that different from those in the UK. What about other essential nutrients? We talked about micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals. What about essential fatty acids? Well, the situation is actually pretty similar. As you can see, there's about 75% of the world's countries that do not achieve adequate intakes of seafood omega-3s, meaning essential fatty acids, DHA and EPA, for those that are familiar with the terms. And there's only 45 countries out of 190 countries analyzed in this study that achieved adequacy, meaning 250 milligrams per day, as recommended by the WHO. Obviously, again, the red and the orange and the yellow are mostly concentrated in the global south, so sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa and the Middle East, and mainland Asia. But we find patches of red and orange also in the global north. And in Europe, for example, Ireland stands out, Denmark, some countries in the Balkan, which are actually deep red, Poland, and so on and so forth. Similarly, for protein malnutrition, when we think of malnourished children, protein energy malnutrition, or chronically inadequate protein intake, we usually picture, children and women in the global south with big bellies and dying of hunger. But in reality, this is a problem that concerns us all. There's about 1 billion people globally that have chronic inadequate intake of protein. And there's actually specific population groups in high-income countries that suffer from this. This is especially the case for young children that have higher requirements due to growth needs. And it's also the case for the elderly. They're often a neglected population group. The elderly need to maintain muscle mass and cognitive function, and many of them, unfortunately, due to various physiological as well as mental issues, do not manage to achieve their protein requirements. This is a study conducted in the US that found that about half of homebound elderly in the US do not reach the recommended daily allowance for protein. And about 20% of them do not meet the RDA for at least one essential amino acid. So this preamble served to depict the unfortunately not so nice situation regarding deficiencies and inadequacies that are spread globally across geographies and across income groups. And it serves to make the point about the importance of animal source foods for global nutrition and health, which is the main focus of my presentation. This is a figure that I particularly like. I don't have time to go in depth into each of these dimensions, but it's just making the point that my presentation focuses on nutrition, nutritional value, but in reality, animal source foods have a multidimensional value that cuts across all dimensions of sustainability. They're essential for livelihoods and resilience, as well as for environmental co-benefits, and obviously they have great social cultural value, as we just heard in the introduction. They're part of many culinary traditions and cultural identities. So again, to assess the nutritional value of foods, we developed a very complex algorithm, which we called the Nutritional Value Score, or NVS. This is a new nutrient profiling system. You're probably all familiar with the Nutri-Score or the Health Star rating. Let's say that this is a much more complex version of that, which encompasses 7 dimensions that are relevant to health and nutrition that you see listed here. Some of these have to do with essential nutrients. So you see vitamins, minerals, protein, omega-3s. For all of these, we consider not just the quantity of nutrients in foods, but also their bioavailability, meaning how much of these nutrients can we actually absorb and utilize for our bodily functions. And we also included 3 components that are instead relevant to non-communicable disease risk. So we have calories, fiber, and nutrient ratios, which are predictive of NCDs. What did we use this for? We used it to assess the nutritional value of about 1,500 foods from multiple regions and countries globally. Here I'm presenting results only for a small subset. These are 400 foods from sub-Saharan Africa. We repeated the same analysis across regions. And what you can see, unfortunately the image is cut from my image, but basically what you can see is that overall the top scoring foods across food groups, here you see represented 27 food groups, are consistently minimally processed, nutrient-dense animal source foods. So top scoring foods are organ meats, fish and seafood, unprocessed red meat of both ruminant and non-ruminant origin, eggs, even moderately processed meat, poultry, dairy to a lesser extent. And this is, again, only a subset of 400 foods from sub-Saharan Africa, but the same results were found across regions that we analyzed. This is what 2 example nutritional profiles look like. I picked cabbage and sardines on purpose, but this is the same also for many other foods that we assessed. The point that I'm trying to make is that there's no food that scores well across all dietary components. There's no food that represents the recipe for addressing all of our nutritional requirements. Complementarity of foods is extremely important. As you can see, cabbage, for example, is rich in fiber, which is completely lacking in sardines, obviously, whereas sardines contain omega-3 fats, which are not present in cabbage. So eating sardines and cabbage together ensures that you get a comprehensive nutritional profile. This is okay, sorry. So this is about the overall nutritional value of foods, the overall nutritional profile. But what happens when we look specifically at micronutrients and we narrow down the spectrum to those micronutrients which are most commonly lacking in our countries? And those are vitamin A, folate, vitamin B12, calcium, iron, and zinc. Well, the picture looks even more striking and more favorable to animal source foods, if anything. So we derived a sub-score, let's call it that way, from the overall nutritional value score. We called it priority micronutrient density score. And what you can see here is that to achieve your requirements against these 6 key essential nutrients, you need a very small amount, both in terms of calories and grams, of nutrient-dense animal source foods. For example, only 11 calories of liver and only 200 calories of goat meat, whereas you need a much larger quantity, both in terms of calories and mass, from plant source foods to achieve requirements against these nutrients. And that is the case for pulses. As you can see, over 600 calories of pulses would be needed to achieve the requirements against these nutrients. 600 calories of pulses are a lot. It's a large volume and one that is not that easily consumed, especially if we think about young children, for example. So just to conclude with a few key messages and key results that came out of our nutritional value assessment at GAIN. Well, first of all, many essential nutrients that are commonly lacking in diets globally, not just in the global south, but also in the global north, are found in larger quantities and more bioavailable forms in animal source foods. And achieving adequacy for those nutrients through a primarily plant-based diet would actually be quite challenging, both in terms of calorie content and in terms of mass, the sheer volume of food that would need to be consumed. Which are the top scoring foods? As we saw from the graph that I showed a minute ago, it's consistently organ meat, fish and seafood, red meat, poultry, dairy, and eggs that score at the top of the pyramid and are rich in multiple micronutrients as well as high quality protein and long chain omega-3s. And obviously, we know, as we will learn in the following presentations, that all of these nutrients are essential for human health and nutrition and for a variety of functions, as I mentioned earlier. But even more concerning regarding the reduction or the elimination of animal source foods from our diets are those nutrients that are uniquely found in animal source foods. So not just in larger quantities, but uniquely found in animal source foods. Those would not be achievable through a primarily plant-based diet unless foods that we consume are fortified and or we complement diet with supplementation. And those are retinol, which is the most bioavailable form of vitamin A, heme iron, vitamins B12 and D3, DHA and EPA, so seafood omega-3 fats, which are exclusively found in seafood and algae to a certain extent, a complete and balanced amino acid profile, as well as a large variety of bioactive peptides and other biochemical compounds that are essential for human health, some of which have been extensively studied, and I've listed them here: creatine, anserine, taurine, etc., and others which are still unknown and yet to be found. So what does this whole story mean for policy programs and investments? Well, I left this question open. I have some ideas, but I'd actually like to hear from you about it later in the discussion. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Orenzi.
Thank you very much, Madame Orenzi. Now, let me give the floor to Professor Jean-François Ocquet from the National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and the Environment. A specialized agronomist specialized in nutrition. He will be saying how easily or not we can replace animal proteins with alternatives. Mr. Ocquet, you have the floor.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and pleasure for me to take the floor here before you. I'm not going to be focusing only on nutrition, but also on communication. When one tries to answer such a complex question, can we replace animal proteins with alternatives, then we need to have a global overview and not only look at nutrition, but also environmental and ethical aspects. I will focus on the conclusions of a report recently published by the Scientific Council of European Science Academies. The main motives for consumers when they buy foods is price, the taste, pleasure when they consume them, and also food safety issues and animal welfare, environmental protection, much lower down in their priorities. This was confirmed by a number of scientific studies in the Mid-Science magazine, and we see that safety concerns, price, and the quality of the food experience are more important for consumers when they purchase, especially animal products, meat. Chinese consumers find price and safety more important than consumers in Africa or Spain and South America. They believe that social identity is more important. Eating meat together, the pleasure of eating meat, so culinary culture, etc. All these values are important to them. And in Western countries, Western Europe and North America, the younger or better educated and richer consumers tend to focus more on safety concerns, but also human health, environment, and the environment, and animal welfare or ethical issues, which would push them to consume other products that are not of animal origin. Now, the livestock systems, traditional livestock systems, influence the desire to consume alternative products. We know that animal production systems differ from one country and one region to the other, and you can see this on this map. You see the low grassland areas, you see more intensive systems. There's so many different livestock rearing systems. When you look at what happens in the feedlots in America or what we have in India and Africa, this has a great impact on purchasing behavior. Many consumers have misconceptions about livestock. And INRAIM, that I did research with, they have a page called Misconceptions on Meat and Livestock Rearing. As you may know, there are many plant-based meat alternatives. And let me start by the plant-based ones, talking about the conclusions that I referred to in the study that I spoke about in the beginning. Now, these are already commercially available. Some of these are highly processed, and I said already this, and they provide us with certain challenges with regards to conventional meat in general and the environmental impacts, with regards to emissions expressed per kilogram of product. This depends on the level of processing, and this will vary in terms of environmental impact. And perhaps we should also weight this with the nutritional value of these products. In general, there are concerns about micronutrients. So with regards to composition, do they have the same composition? And also bioavailability. In general, we see that there are higher levels of salt, fat, and additives, especially in highly processed products. And there are questions about their long-term health effects. A great deal of study has taken place on this. Now, consumer acceptance is relatively high. So taste and price, of course, are quite important when it comes to purchasing. There are additional studies and technological progress to improve the texture and also work on bioavailability. With regards to products coming from biomass and precision fermentation, now these techniques focus on coming up with specific proteins from microorganisms and not from animals. Here again, the environmental impact varies greatly. It is extremely difficult to draw conclusions. Now, when you build large factories, you focus in a small area, but there's very high energy costs for these locations. Now, for nutritional profile, well, often this is quite balanced. However, one major challenge for people producing in these sectors is these large-scale mass production, and of course that is very costly. And also there is the GMO problem, because these microorganisms have been transformed to produce protein specifically. Now, as to insects, now this is a highly efficient and sustainable protein source. Very good profile. There's iron, zinc, and bioavailability is there. There are problems with regards to allergenic potential and digestibility. Now, large-scale production, here again, and associated costs are problematic in Western countries, especially in Europe and North America. Consumer acceptance remains low, largely due to neophobia and cultural perceptions. However, for processed forms, these will be more acceptable to consumers. There are ethical challenges, including animal welfare implications for insect production. Now, cultured meat, as we call it, of course, this name has been debated. The FAO calls this cell food because it's not really meat. In Europe, of course, there are animal welfare and environmental issues. However, for environmental issues, the companies in the sector, well, based on the Oxford University study from 2011, there have been several studies since then, which the press has not shared, but the life cycle assessments have shown a great number of uncertainties. Cultivated meat might have lower emissions than traditional beef production, but be higher than when it's compared to poultry. And it depends on how, of course, the energy is provided in these factories. And of course, this requires a great deal of energy. As to health benefits and risks, we have very little information because there's very limited market exposure. There's some studies on the composition of these products, saying that we have low iron, low vitamins, especially B12. These are all essential, and less fat, and very little little on digestibility and bioavailability of the nutrients. These products have been authorized in Singapore, US, Israel, New Zealand, for some companies, about 5 companies, and an assessment, a specific assessment of long-term effects on human health still need to be done. There's very low consumer acceptance because these are considered unnatural, and there are also certain ethical and cultural issues. Sociologists have studied this, and they've said for a new animal product to be accepted by consumers and to have market penetration, there should be very few socio-institutional and technological changes. These cell foods, or insects, etc., or cultivated meat, they require a degree of technological changes, and also the regulatory framework should change. So the future food should be comparable to plant-based meat alternatives, as demonstrated in the report that I referred to earlier. The two factors, technology and commerciality readiness, level 0 to 9 and 1 to 6, as you see here. And these are highest for plant-based alternatives and lowest for cultured meat. The investors and companies in their strategies are trying to come up with a win-win approach that is to reconcile expectations of consumers, see how they can respond to their needs, taking account of their cultural values, because obviously they want to make money, these private companies, especially for cultured meat. And this is mainly, the research is taking place mainly within private companies. There's an important paragraph in the research I referred to on ethical aspects, and there are 4 headings here: well-being, then there's autonomy, and fairness. Consumers want products that are good for their health and protect the environment. They want freedom of choice. And obviously, these products need to be accessible and affordable. Ethical issues for consumers, well, it's not only for consumers, but you also have the farmers, livestock farmers, who are looking at the economic impact of developing these new markets. They are mindful of the fact that they might be marginalized, and they want to maintain their activity. And this is increasingly difficult because of a greater and greater competition. We should not forget the concerns of the producers of alternative meat alternatives. They want to get into the new markets. They have constraints, controls, and they are competing with traditional livestock. And lastly, there are all the ethical aspects related to animals. There's a risk that there will be fewer animals than therefore being reared. The animals' welfare, animal welfare is important. And of course, this varies from one animal to the next, and especially when you go from insects to mammals. So the question here, and I'm going to conclude with this, is what the recommendations are for policymakers. Transparency must be increased, and labeling standards as well. There are a large number of alternatives, meat alternatives, that are only being developed by private companies. This is the case for cultured meat. And so we need to be able to assess correctly the nutritional value of these products. We need to develop health and nutrition guidelines to guarantee a good quality of meat alternatives that are developed. We need to also develop environmental sustainability standards. A great deal of work has to be done here. Everyone is based on life cycle analyses that have shown their limits. So we need to look at more than GHG emissions when we look at these alternative proteins. Consumer information. Some people talk about educating consumers, but they should be provided information and be aware and be able to combat misinformation. We need to develop a regulatory framework and a science-based policies, not just have our views determining what the policy should be. And as I said earlier, we should look at all dimensions of the ethical considerations and make sure that we can take account of cultural, economic diversity, traditions. And I will conclude by these recommendations for policymakers. Thank you once again for having invited me.
Voilà. Mais merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very important and very specific information that you've given us. And now I should like to give the floor to Ms. Stanton. I'm sorry, the microphone of the speaker was not on.
Voilà. Voilà.
Okay. Okay, I should now like to give the floor to Professor Alice Stanton of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. She is a clinical specialist, a researcher, and a specialist in general medicines. And she's going to talk to us about the topic, what do we really know about animal source foods and chronic disease? You have 15 minutes, madam.
Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, I'm really pleased to be here as a clinician, as a researcher and as a medical educationist from Ireland to talk to you about the relationship between animal source foods and chronic diseases and what's the current state of play. What do we really know about these relationships? I'm in large part an academic clinician, but I have had relationships with the agri-food industry, and I also work with a number of committees and boards for the relationship between food and human health. We've all seen these headlines. Over the past 30 years, it started with eggs. Eating eggs was really dangerous, raised your cholesterol. That's been debunked, is no longer agreed science. Then there was a move on to dairy, in particular full-fat dairy, again, more recently debunked. The last 10 years have been focused on red meat and processed red meat. We've seen lots of headlines like meat is toxic, go vegetarian. Should we do that? And it's not just the public press that have been putting forward these ideas. There's been numerous scientific publications, policy documents, and national and international dietary guidelines that have suggested that it would be good for human health if there was either dramatic reductions or exclusion of various animal source foods, particularly red meat and dairy from the human diet. You can't see the top box there. What it says is that the right top publication said that each Frankfurter sandwich eaten results in 35 minutes of life lost. The next one says that actually if you reduced your dairy intake from 3 glasses, or the equivalent in cheese and yogurt, 3 glasses of milk a day, down to less than 1, you'd increase your life expectancy by 1 year. And the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate, its most recent reports, it publishes in the Lancet a report approximately every 2 years, and they've been claiming since 2020 that approximately 1.9 million deaths were associated with excessive consumption of dairy, red and processed meats. But the most important publication is a report that comes from the Global Burden of Disease collaborators. They're headquartered in the Institute of Health Metrics and Health Evaluation in University of Washington, Seattle. And they have multiple collaborators internationally, all around the world. They produce reports on risk factors causing disease at least every 2 years. And nearly all of the policy documents and dietary guidelines that I've illustrated in this slide and the actual scientific journals rely on global burden of disease data and analysis. So let's have a look at whether they are reliable. What I've shown here are the dietary risks and deaths that were associated with those dietary risks in the Global Burden of Disease 2017 analysis in blue columns and the 2019 analysis in the red columns. And excesses are on top. And the big excesses, I agree with, are obesity, excessive calories, excessive sodium or excessive salt, excessive trans fats, and the big deficiencies, and Flaminio has alluded to that, are child and maternal malnutrition, diets low in whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and omega-3 fatty acids. Most of those deficiencies, particularly child and maternal malnutrition and diets low in omega-3 fatty acids, are critically dependent on animal source foods. They did say in both the 2017 and 2019 analyses that diets low in milk would cause deaths. But it's a huge underestimate because they only counted the protection afforded by dairy with colorectal cancer. They omitted the fact that there's good evidence that up to 2 or 3 full-fat dairy servings a day actually protect against overweight and obesity with knock-on implications for diabetes mellitus. That you actually, if you are drinking the equivalent of 2 full-fat dairy servings a day, you have a 32% reduction in heart attacks and strokes, with knock-on implications for a 25% reduction in total mortality. But the biggest difference between the 2017 analysis and the 2019 analysis that's of interest to this audience is that the number of deaths attributed to red meat consumption increased 36-fold, from 25,000 to almost 900,000 deaths a year globally. Now, 25,000 deaths being caused by excessive, very excessive red meat consumption might be credible, but 896,000 deaths is not credible. And this increase was just put into the data without any evidence whatsoever. Global Burden of Disease collaborators said from the first mouthful per week that you had of unprocessed red meat, there was an increase in colorectal cancer, breast cancers, heart attacks, strokes, and deaths from diabetes mellitus. A group of us looked at the medical literature and we couldn't see that relationship. What I've shown here are the 10 largest cohort studies that have looked at the relationship between mortality, deaths, associated with red meat consumption on the horizontal axis. And you can see the relationships are flat. In the global study, which looks at 20 countries from 5 different continents, from European studies, from Asian studies, and from North American studies. There are 2 studies from North America that do show a small increase, but there's 8 studies that show a completely flat relationship up to 100 grams of red meat per day, which is very much in excess of what is being eaten worldwide and certainly in Western Europe. Because of that disparity between what we could see in the medical literature, 6 of us got together, 6 professors from 4 different countries, from Ireland, from the UK, from Belgium and Australia, and we wrote to The Lancet, which is where the Global Burden of Disease collaborators published their work. And we said, you know, the 36-fold higher estimate of deaths attributable to red meat intake, is this reliable? And also, what would happen to deficiency deaths from iron deficiency anemia, from protein deficiency, from zinc deficiency, from B12 deficiency, if red meat was excluded from the diet? There was a considerable delay in acceptance in our letter, but eventually, because journalists got interested, the lead author or lead editor of The Lancet, Richard Horton, actually reverse his original opinion to reject our letter and published it. And eventually we got an answer from Professor Christopher Murray as the lead of the Global Burden of Disease collaborators. And he said, actually, yeah, we got it wrong. Actually, red meat doesn't cause hemorrhagic strokes, and the relationship with heart attacks is really weak. We'll do better next time in our next publication. We were delighted when people like Gordon Guyatt, who's one of the originators of evidence-based medicine from McMaster University in Canada, said, you know, this is a real problem. We cannot have global health metrics influencing policy that are not evidence-based. We need an answer. Likewise, we're very pleased when the Academy of Nutrition Science and the World Cancer Research Fund got involved and said, this is a problem. So we were delighted when actually there was additional publications in Nature Medicine the following year, where the Global Burden of Disease collaborators published their burden of proof studies concerning red meat, vegetables, systolic blood pressure, and one other index. Concerning red meat, very different conclusions. No or very weak evidence that unprocessed red meat is associated with any increased risk. Insufficient evidence to make any strong or conclusive recommendations. Optimal intake of unprocessed red meat could be as high as 200 grams a day, which is way excessive. There's another little bit of information that I think you should be aware of. A number of cohort studies have now specifically examined not red meat or processed meat in isolation. They've looked at it when it's part of a healthy diet. And what the European study found, no excess colorectal cancer risk in participants who have high intakes of red and processed meats, who also have high intakes of fibre and/or fish. The Canadian study, Alberta's Tomorrow study, found that co-consumption of fruit, vegetables, whole grains and/or fibre reduces or eliminates any cancer risks associated with red and processed meats. And the PURE study, the Prospective Urban Rural Epidemiology Study, which is a global study. It's the study that has looked at data from 21 countries across the world, low-income, medium-income, high-income countries. And they devised a healthy eating diet and score, which focuses on the inclusion of 6 healthy foods. So fruit, vegetables, legumes, nuts, fish, and dairy. And where people include lots of those foods, you actually get at least an 8% lower chance of risk and a 6% lower chance of cardiovascular events. Each of those 6 foods makes a similar protective contribution to the score, and that includes fish, seafood, and dairy in all its forms. And they also looked at what happens if you actually introduce red meat into the model, and it made no difference whatsoever. And that indicates that red meat, unprocessed red meat, has a neutral effect on mortality and cardiovascular health. Very much in keeping with what we can see previously in the literature when you just look at unprocessed red meat and processed meat as well. So, my final slide. We need to bear in mind that a healthy diet needs to do 2 things. It needs to protect against malnutrition in all its forms, as well as against non-communicable chronic diseases. So the non-communicable chronic diseases are diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, and various cancers. As Flaminio has already alluded, dramatic reductions in animal source foods, as advised by many plant-based diets, will worsen already prevalent micronutrient and protein deficiencies worldwide. And from my point of view, the relationships between animal source foods and chronic diseases are as follows. Any possible adverse effects of red and processed meat consumption on non-communicable chronic diseases are very small and uncertain. Furthermore, they appear to disappear completely when consumed as part of a healthy diet. Poultry meat and eggs, the evidence is now no impact on heart attacks, strokes, cancers, diabetes mellitus. And dairy and seafood are associated with protections against obesity, cardiovascular events, brain ill health, and some cancers. Very happy to answer any questions.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stanton. I must admit that every time we organise an intergroup, I am astonished at the high quality of the contributions, and I should like to thank my team, particularly Katerina, for all the work that they have done in this context. Today, we also invited DG Santé to come along, but unfortunately nobody was able to join us this time round. Nevertheless, they're going to continue working with our intergroup in the future. So I open discussions now, and I should also like to thank all those colleagues of ours who have come into this room at one time or another and demonstrated their interest in the intergroup. Mr. Singer, Mr. Buda, Mr. McNamara, Mr. Karim, and others. So thank you very much for coming along today. And if any of you who are in the room would like to take the floor now, please do so. Mr. Buda.
Thank you very much for this debate. I think it's extremely important to look at this issue regarding red meat consumption, because we know that in the last legislature, unfortunately, the European Commission sent us a shockwave, so to speak, regarding the consumption of red meat, in the sense that they tried to promote the idea that red meat consumption was responsible for certain types of cancers. I also believe today that we cannot see any true connection between the consumption of red meat and the appearance of cancers. On the contrary.
Yeah, okay, I'm waiting, no problem. Because it's
Sorry pour le petit problème technique, c'est bon? Voilà, excusez-moi, M. Bouddha, je vous laisse commencer.
I'm sorry, Mr. Buda. Please start again.
short. Sunt absolut convins că
Again, as I was saying, I'm convinced that a balanced consumption of red meat cannot lead to an increase in the number of cancers. And I believe it's very important that we should have a balanced diet, because without some consumption of red meat, our health would be even more affected. And this would affect first and foremost our capacity to work. Because it's very important to remember that when we discuss all sorts of diet plans, the need to maintain people's capacity to work. They need enough strength in order to work. And we also need to keep our citizens healthy. Because if we don't do that, then further down the road we shall have healthcare costs, increased healthcare costs. And I have a question here regarding this lab meat. Well, meat between inverted commas, because I cannot name this meat. It's a product that imitates meat that is cultured in a lab. Do you have any studies regarding this kind of product? Because unfortunately I see that we have projects financed with European funds regarding these products. Well, I think this is the wrong road to take. I don't think such a product that is grown in a lab, in a steam vase with all sorts of substances, I can't think of it as something that is healthy for the human body. I think we are toying with we are playing dice with the future of our next generations, and if we don't stop this phenomenon, we might assist to a phenomenon of degeneration of our species in 30 years, 40 years, or 100 years. So I'm interested to know if you've assessed the impact of such lab-produced meat on human health. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll take that question, and I think such studies definitely have not been done, either with precision fermentation products, insect products, or with cultured meat. It's just too early. Likewise, there has to be concern about the plant-based alternatives. All four of those products are not pure products. They need multiple chemicals in order to stick them together to give an attractive colour, an odour, texture. So currently, all our ultra-processed products, even including the chicken nuggets that are available in Singapore, my understanding is that at least 40% of that protein is pea protein, because it's just impossible to make the product edible without that addition, plus multiple other chemicals. One has to be concerned as a health physician with the ultra-processed nature of these products, because there's increasing evidence that an excess of ultra-processed food is very damaging to human health, causing heart attacks, causing heart strokes, causing multiple cancers, in large part, or certainly a considerable amount, due to the excessive calories that are consumed and the relationship with obesity. So I have huge concerns, and I certainly wouldn't want a worldwide experiment with meat alternatives without looking at either the deficiency area or the chronic disease area. I'm a clinical pharmacologist, and if we were proposing to put a new drug on the market for everyone in the world to take without very good data, so phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 trials, there's absolutely no way it would be allowed. And we are proposing that for the meat alternatives currently. I'm not against developing alternative products, because the world may well need alternative additional sources of food, protein and nutrients, but it should be done carefully.
Monsieur Auquet?
Mr. Auquet, thank you for your question. There are different questions, in fact, included in your question itself. Now, we're looking at this concept of a balance between vegetal and animal proteins, 50% of vegetal proteins and 50% of animal proteins in a ration. This is the optimum ratio to get a good balance in micronutrients, particularly in vitamins and iron. So we have two key words here, optimize and get a balance. Now, too many calories and too many processed products, I share the conclusions of Alice on this totally. When we're looking at cultured meats, I think that a priori, as a researcher, I cannot take an a priori position against cultured meats, because researchers are open to innovation. So what we need to do is explore all these innovations that come up, but not all of them are good, according to experts. So once we have had experts analyze a new technology, such as cultured meats, then we can come up with a precise, well-argumented, objective stance as to whether it is good or not. So this cultured meat may not be a good idea, because we don't have, as the butchers have, expertise in meat per se. So if we have, for example, a wine grower who picks his grapes and gets the juice, then he has a chemical process which transforms sugar into alcohol and produces wine. So we have these muscles which transfer into meat, and when you are fabricating or manufacturing muscular fiber, this is not meat. Objectively, you have this cultured products, and there are products which are manufactured by mixing vegetable proteins with proteins come from these cellular cultures. We call these cultured meats. And when we are looking at cultured meats, there are a whole series of growth factors, etc., which we have not tested adequately in terms of the long-term effects of these products. And in France, there are approximately 60 researchers who, in the Monde newspaper, signed a document saying that you have to apply the cautionary principle to these new products, because we don't have adequate data, we don't have enough information. We have certain concerns, certain fears, because the antibiotic and hormone residues and growth factors can have effects on health, negative effects on health. And when we're looking at the cellular cultures, it's fine. a priori, there is little iron in these products. So, little hemoglobin. What we should be calling these, in fact, is not meat, but cellular foods.
Thank you. Very interesting question, multiple questions, as was already mentioned. I wanted to touch upon two aspects that you mentioned in your questions on workforce health and the impact of our workforce getting sick on healthcare costs. I think that this is a very important point that perhaps was not covered yet. So I've been working for the past few months on true cost accounting, which is basically a way to quantify the real costs of foods and diets, both in terms of healthcare costs, in terms of environmental costs, and in terms of costs to our society, so also in terms of fair livelihoods, fair trade, etc. And one thing that we've noticed in the first steps, let's say, of our new project on true cost accounting again, is that unfortunately, all of our true cost accounting estimates are based on the impacts of non-communicable diseases and risks of non-communicable diseases. No one quantifies the impacts in terms of costs, including healthcare costs, of nutrient deficiencies. Not even the big FAO reports that are quite famous, like the SOFA report, which just came out, the 2024 version with the latest numbers that says that that we spend about 3.5, if I'm not wrong, trillion US dollars in costs in terms of healthcare due to people getting sick because of unhealthy diets. But those estimates do not include the costs of people not being productive, not being able to work due to micronutrient deficiencies and inadequacies in protein, inadequacies in essential fatty acids, which are indispensable for brain health and for muscle health. So this is an area which is completely understudied and under-researched yet. Everyone talks about NCDs, no one talks about the effects on health and the related costs related to micronutrient deficiencies. And the other thing that I wanted to add that was also touched upon is there's a bunch of studies that quantify the effects, for example, of red meat consumption or processed meat consumption or the effects of animal source foods in general on health. There's also a bunch of studies that assess the effects of plant source foods on health, and those are both the processed and unprocessed ones. And in most cases, these studies say that eating plant-based is healthier than eating animal-based. But when they factor in the ultra-processing of plant-source diets and animal-source diets, in reality, the positive effects of plant-source diets disappear. So that means that, yes, eating vegetables and fruits is healthy, for sure. We all know that. Eating whole grains is healthy. We all know that. But eating plant-based diets that are based on ultra-processed products, which is the reality of diets, at least in the Western world, is absolutely not healthier than eating unprocessed, nutrient-dense animal source foods.
Thanks for organising this today with Alexander, and thank you all for your contributions. It's been excellent. You've answered a lot of my questions, to be honest, but I suppose I'm a little bit worried in the direction that we're going, knowing that, EU farmers produce food to a very high standard, and maybe to get your views on maybe the next 20 years. Do you worry the direction that we're going in? And for me as an MEP, what can we do policy-wise and maybe through funding, what we can push for? Obviously, Horizon funding is very important for the likes of you, Alison, and everybody to make sure that we keep... I see the value in scientific research and how important it is to guide us, because without that, we've nothing. So I'm wondering your funding streams, how do you feel that goes? Or is it private? Is there something the EU can do more in that space? Thank you.
Money is always welcome. I think we probably do need some major studies analysing data from the multiple cohort studies, looking at whole foods versus processed foods versus ultra-processed foods. At the moment, particularly for processed meat, all processed meat is put into one bundle. And there's a big difference between a deep fat fried chicken goujon and a a Parma ham from Italy, which you eat in very thin slices. All of that is bundled together. So there is data already available, and I think large studies which look at various animal source foods, plant source foods, level of processing would be very, very useful in disentangling. It would require huge collaboration. I think the other thing that is interactions between scientists and the European parliamentarians and the policymakers. So listening to what independent scientists say and actually questioning the source of the recommendation. So absolutely, I think that the Nordic nutritional guidelines, which were actually based on Global Burden of Disease 2021 before it was published. I've never heard of a dietary guideline being produced from a publication which hadn't happened. So none of us scientists could disentangle the evidence. So I think questioning the science behind the guidance that is brought to you is very, very important.
Je voudrais rajouter un point très bref.
Very briefly, I agree with the previous speaker. However, the management of European research products is very complicated administratively. And I would really speak in favor of simplifying the administration. Everything is studied very closely, and it's a very fussy approach. And I think we really need to simplify the administration and allow researchers to do their job. I totally agree with you, and thank you for this, Michael.
Thank you very much for organising another really interesting and informative meeting. I suppose I just have a couple of questions. One, I suppose, is a very Irish one for Dr. Stanton, and that's: have you ever been invited onto RTE, the state broadcaster? Then on your presentation, obviously you started off with red meat, and then it sort of moved towards red meat and processed meat. I mean, the last I heard was that processed meats were particularly dangerous. I mean, I don't know where I heard it, but in the general media. So I just wonder. I mean, and you very convincingly debunked the studies saying that red meat were dangerous. Are you as confident in the debunking of the claim that processed meats are dangerous? Because there's a very large amount of processed pig meat, in particular, on the shelves in Ireland, and certainly and throughout Europe. And then, sorry, this question might be slightly off the topic that we've discussed, but Professor, you mentioned, Professor Oquette, you mentioned the dangers to human health that the presence of growth promoters and hormones, etc., in meat pose. And I suppose I'm thinking of a slightly different debate that's ongoing in the background, but DG Sante have highlighted the difficulty in detecting growth promoters and hormones in imported meats from countries where they're legal. Is the position that even when they can't be detected, that the presence of those hormones or growth promoters pose a risk to human health, Or is it only if they're in sufficient quantities or they've been sufficiently recently administered to animals to be detectable that they pose a risk to human health? And I'm sorry, I know that's not what you came to address, and if you don't have an answer, I completely understand. But again, thank you very much to Katharina and my colleague Deputy Cassar for a really informative and interesting meeting.
Merci, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Just could you very briefly respond, because in 5 minutes we will be ending, unfortunately, but that's the way it is.
I'll answer briefly on the processed meat versus red meat. There is a little bit more evidence for processed meat in causing colon cancer. However, I would say that the EPIC study and tomorrow's Alberta's study actually show that if you ate fruit and vegetables and fibre and whole grains and fish, actually there was little or no risk for either red or processed meat. I think what I mentioned already is we need to actually start unbundling the term processed meat, because there's a big difference between processing with salting and drying from addition of multiple chemicals, and I think we should look again at distinguishing that. And I certainly think that's an area for research. And I think it's important because, in fact, we need some processing for whole carcass use and the circular economy. So it's important to all of the economics of the European Union and of the world. And we also need some processing to maintain for food safety, to actually protect against infections that can be delivered with some animal source foods. So we need to look at the pluses and minuses. I've occasionally spoken on RTE, but not recently.
Concernant les hormones,
I don't have any specific answers on hormones. Just to say that this is a different problem. When we import beef from countries where hormones are authorized, it's not the same as when you have cell culture, because then you add all the hormones, and it's a cocktail of growth factors and hormones, and animals from other countries only have a few hormones added to the endogenous hormones. So the problem is different.
Parfait, merci beaucoup.
Wonderful. Let me now very briefly conclude. So what I got from the general discussion today is that, one, we need more science, fewer slogans that are emotion-based, and secondly, we talk about food excesses, but we don't talk enough about the things that we lack. And as someone from the Santé Committee, we need to look at our food production capacity to meet the global needs in the area of food. Thank you very much for our panelists. You were wonderful, and the timing was great.
Just a moment, because a very short intervention about the innovation. It's very important that we have innovation, we have research, but it's very important to understand I need a limit, or in this case, artificial meat, in my opinion, is necessary block, because it's very, very dangerous for the future, for the new generation. I need to understand this.
I agree, but we have to argue that very precisely.
OK. Merci, M. Bouddha.